Los Angeles is one of the largest cities in the United States, with communities so contrasting in culture, lifestyle, and income that at times, the divides are impossible to ignore. Beyond the city are excessive mansions in the Hollywood Hills, while in the heart of LA, you have diverging neighborhoods of middle and lower class housing. The southern half of the city has a reputation for crime and gang warfare, and has been showcased as such in many criminal movies, TV shows, and classic video games. You might even recognize the topic of this video as a result. Either way, the Imperial Courts housing has earned a legendary reputation for violence and criminal activity. But what could cause this World War II era housing project to turn so rancid? And what is it like in the modern day? Join us to find out, because today we discover the history of LA's Imperial Courts housing project. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Just like other major cities across the country, in the early 20th century, LA was in a housing crisis as more people came from the eastern and central USA looking for employment during the Depression. In addition to the city's naturally high immigration rates, by the end of the 1940s, the city had a population of 1.5 million, with 300,000 arriving since the 1930 census. With such a large influx of people in a city that would only get bigger, it was pretty apparent that LA needed to get directly involved with housing development to keep order. One of the neighborhoods that had seen this impressive buildup was Watts, located in the southern part of LA County. Watts was originally a Spanish colonial ranch town. Still, since its establishment in 1820, the westward expansion of Americans with European heritage, trains, and industrial hubs had gradually transformed the neighborhood into an African American and Spanish-speaking community. Hence, the area was renamed the Watts neighborhood in 1907 and joined LA in 1926. During the Second Great Migration to California, caused by the Depression, the area was still almost entirely African and Mexican American. It was after this that the Imperial Courts housing were built. To accommodate the growing local population, construction began on multiple housing projects during World War II. The Housing Authority of Los Angeles recognized the concentration of new or migrating residents for their value in the American war industry, so the city began construction of the Imperial Courts in 1944. Just off Imperial Highway, the project spans 7 acres and originally contained 25 buildings. Since then, it's grown even further and now includes 86 buildings with 485 residences. While the different sections don't have formal designations, the community has given all 4 corners their names: the Funny Side, the Pill, the Island, and the Bull. At first, life in the projects, while visibly separated from the wealthier sections of the city, was peaceful, as hundreds of working families lived there. At the same time, many residents had the ambition and personal leeway to go to work and move beyond the subsidized housing. To clarify, in the early days, only portions of the complex were subsidized for low-wage families, and many families chose to live there voluntarily. In fact, reception from the city was generally positive, and early mentions in local papers don't disagree, as they celebrated local events like Halloween and community parties. Like previous projects we've discussed here, it was a community at heart. Even religious institutions recognized the projects. Take, for example, the 1965 case of Miss Dolores Wright, who was awarded by the Christian Welfare Bureau or the Catholic Youth Organization for outstanding service to fellow residents, despite herself being a mother of 15 children. Even so, fate would have some very dark surprises in store. All it would take was a few decades, and I need to warn you, this downfall happened fast and is very disturbing. Perhaps an example of how unwanted surprises can creep up around every corner. When they do, it's essential to be ready with a good life insurance policy. Thanks to the sponsor of this video, Policy Genius, you can be sure that your loved ones will be provided for in a worst-case scenario. Policy Genius knows how valuable your time is. That's why their technology makes it easy to compare life insurance quotes from America's top insurers in just a few clicks. With Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $25 per month for $1 million of coverage. Some options offer coverage in as little as 1 week and avoid unnecessary medical exams. Their licensed award-winning agents can help you find the best fit for your needs. They work for you, not the insurance companies, meaning that they don't have an incentive to recommend one insurer over another, so you can trust their guidance. Policy Genius is for parents, caregivers, and anyone else who has people who depend on them. They simplify the process of getting life insurance so you can protect the people you love. So no wonder they have thousands of 5-star reviews on Google and Trustpilot. Your loved ones deserve a financial safety net. You deserve a smarter way to find and buy it. So head to policygenius.com/itshistory or click the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you can save. Thanks to Policy Genius for supporting the channel, and now back to our story. Now, some of you probably recognize this neighborhood from somewhere, right? Well, the courts have been featured everywhere, from movies, crime scenes, and TV, or in Grand Theft Auto under the name Rancho Court. So you probably already know that the Imperial Courts projects have a reputation. In fact, in 1965, the district exploded. Literally. When 21-year-old Marquette Fry was arrested for drunk driving on August the 11th, the man's brother and mother became tangled in a fight with the arresting officers, leading to an expected escalation. The community saw the event as a use of excessive force, even though Fry failed the sobriety test. To the hundreds of friends, neighbors, and onlookers, that didn't matter, and a failure of communication by both the police and the neighborhood authorities made things even worse. At first, residents only harassed passing Caucasian people, then they began stoning drivers and attacking people on the street. Pretty soon, it was a full-on riot. I need to add a little emphasis here. Things got ugly fast. Fires were started across the neighborhood, and when the fire department responded, they were shot at. Looting, theft, and attacks on police and civilians were rampant to the point that the lieutenant governor called in the National Guard. And pretty soon, almost 15,000 California guardsmen patrolled the almost 50-mile-wide area before and after sunset curfews. 5 days later, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. arrived to get an in-person perspective from community and city leaders, having cut short a similar mission in Puerto Rico after news of the riots reached him. By his arrival, 34 people had died and over 10,000 had been arrested. Then, in the measured way he is so iconic for as a leader, he warned against further riots while hearing from residents who said the only way to be heard was, quote, to start a riot. If you know anything about Reverend King, you understand that this was the last thing he wanted to hear. It made him greatly concerned about the initiative of the civil rights movement if it became and stayed violent, as contrary to popular belief, danger or insanity is not something most Americans want to be associated with. Still, it is an outcome achievable when people are pressured or manipulated by the right abuse or narrative. Political factions understand this mechanism very well. Thanks to it, they're able to weaponize good intentions, causing normal people to lash out in unexpected and unimaginable ways. With that in mind, King posed as a mediator between the neighborhood, the state, and even the federal government, with President Johnston thanking him for arriving in the city to establish order. What King told reporters over the following days not only accurately outlines what happened, but it explains how a nice community was transformed into such chaos over a relatively short amount of time. In his view, the problems were, quote, environmental and not racial. The economic deprivation, social isolation, inadequate housing, and general despair of thousands of African Americans teeming in the northern and western ghettos are the ready seeds for a tragic expression of violence. And King deplored the violence. Still, he knew from his experience that he could use it in a way, raving against the failures of the Los Angeles authorities to distribute federal grants and financial assistance programs through meaningless local bickering. That fall, he rallied against the tragedy, asking a crowd, quote, "What did Watts accomplish but the death of 34 and the injury of thousands more? What did it profit us to burn down the stores and factories where we sought employment? The way of riots is not a way of progress. but a blind alley of death and destruction which wreaks its havoc, hardest against the rioters themselves. The growing hatred towards police that led and followed the riots drove an increasing number of angry and disenfranchised men to gangs. At least there, they felt they had some power, and from there, things didn't de-escalate. 3 rival gangs eventually dominated the suburb, and dozens of other minor gangs gathered under them. Their feuding was intense, and it was bloody. By February of 1989, parents in the Imperial Courts actively opposed their children doing so much as going to school, as the fractional fighting was intense. It was so bad that they began to demand that the nearby Jordan High School be closed, and their children be transferred to other districts and be given safe, city-funded transportation. In their complaint to the Federal Department of Education, they wrote, quote, "There exist life-threatening and dangerous conditions in the classrooms, on the campus, and in the surrounding neighborhoods. Gang members from the Jordan Downs projects would openly threaten children with knives and guns at and on their way to school. Parents claimed that almost every child in the project was being kept from school, but the local Board of Education tried to deny this accusation. One teenager told the LA Times, quote, "If they know where you live, they mess with you. Pick and push on you, they hit you. They ask you what set you're from. I tell them I don't gangbang, but they don't care." Local families teamed up with the American Association of Women. This little-known conservative women's group aimed to fill political power vacuums in communities like Watts and the Imperial Courts. Some have suggested this was an opportunistic move to earn local influence, but that's doubtful. After all, the problem was far from made up. In fact, between that year and 2005, there were 500 homicides in Watts. The vast majority were gang-related, although naturally, some remained purely random events. In December of 2005, it got even worse, as 18 shootings resulted in 7 deaths. These horrific numbers brought about 2 effects. For starters, the city police set up the official Watts Gang Task Force to monitor and control gang violence under one umbrella. Then, perhaps most importantly, there was a truce by many significant factions of rivaling gangs, one that has primarily held out to this day. While homicides and violence haven't disappeared compared to what they once were in the 90s, the matter is much better controlled today. The projects have had turbulent years and are likely to have more as time passes and future tensions arise. But for now, there is an order to live here. In 2001, the projects were reported to house 1,400 residents, a number largely stable across its lifetime. And while most people are mainly under the poverty line, a 2001 article in the LA Times quotes citizens stating, "We are not low class." The neighborhood was also included in the Poverty and Race Research Action Council of Washington, D.C., a survey titled Autonomy of Urban Crisis. While Watts and Imperial Courts are only briefly mentioned, the study pointed out that the courts have faced the same problem projects across the country have, as prices soar above minimum wage to slowly expand the wage gap and lower the poverty line. The people here partly stay by choice, but the gap has narrowed since the economic golden age. Reverend King had told reporters in 1965 that the infamous riots had been, quote, "the beginning of a stirring of those people in our society who have been bypassed by the progress of the past decade." Today, it seems like that advice had been largely ignored or has simply been forgotten. Still, the community stays together and works together. One example from 2005 was the converting of one apartment into a proper recording studio for residents, hoping to show the world their sound. As the LA Times write, quote, "The music seemed to have gone back to the spirit of the earliest days as hundreds of residents cheered the ribbon cutting. The project faced mountains of red tape, 22 separate committee meetings, and leagues of funding and technical issues. Still, it was achieved through the grit and determination of young and former residents paying it forward." Additionally, the community launched an attractive online documentary service named Where We Live that details life in the projects and takes intimate accounts of the residents' perspectives and how they go through life here. While these studies are nuanced, the documentary stays largely positive while being upfront about the challenges such communities foster and encourage. But still, not everything is so positive, as to keep order, residents need to live with the fact that police helicopters do hourly patrols of the neighborhood. It's one thing to do a study on these fallen projects, but it could be an entirely different thing to vastly expand our knowledge on the topic by getting first-hand accounts or even academic information in the comment section. So let's keep expanding this topic. And if you have more topics, make sure you DM me on Instagram. Anyways, until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.